Welcome to the Digital Authoritarianism podcast series. Each episode uncovers how digital technologies are reshaping authoritarian politics, revealing global and regional patterns of digital repression and the creative ways civil societies fight back, speaking to researchers, journalists, and activists. The hosts of this podcast are Janjira, Sangeeta, and Andreas, research fellows at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, Hamburg. We are glad to share this important conversation with you. Let's dive in. Welcome to the second episode of our podcast series on digital authoritarianism, brought to you by the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, or the GIGA. I'm Sangeeta Mahapatra, research fellow at the GIGA and co-lead of our project, Digital Authoritarianism through Lawfare in Asia. In our previous project, we looked at how governments weaponized fake news laws to target civil society actors. We mapped patterns of repression and pushback measures in our database, www.fakenewslawfare.com. I invite you to please go through it. Now, in our current project, we have widened the lens, and now we are looking at the whole gamut of legal measures and policies and practices being used by governments in Asia to tighten their grip over the digital space. The civil society is not keeping quiet. It is also battening down the hatches and trying to protect and defend their expressive rights. It is in this landscape of regulatory fluidity and fragmentation and power tussle, generative AI is playing the role of a game changer, giving governments an unprecedented lever of control and coercion. And in this, they are bolstered by big tech companies. Therefore, we are at a pivot point of digital authoritarianism where technology, law, and power collide. That's why today's episode focuses on generative AI and the authoritarian turn, and on rethinking state and platform accountability. As you are listening, you might want to ask yourselves, who actually benefits from the generative AI tools that is being deployed, and who all are left vulnerable? So in this episode, we answer a few important questions. How is generative AI being deployed for authoritarian purposes? What risks do they pose, especially to democracies with weaker regulatory oversights? And what can meaningful accountability look like when states and tech companies act in tandem? To help us think through this, I'm very happy and honored to have Prateek Waghre with us. Prateek is a technologist turned policy researcher. He's currently the head of programs and partnership at Tech Global Institute and also a fellow at Tech Policy Press, where he has extensively written on state of free expression in India. He was previously the executive director at Internet Freedom Foundation in India and a researcher at the Takshashila Institution. His work sits at the intersection of technology and digital rights. And so, if you're wondering how generative AI, law, and power all fit together, Prateek is a great person to be in conversation with. Prateek, welcome to the podcast. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Sangeeta. Looking forward to this.
So, let's start, Prateek, with how states are using these tools. We are seeing several states flood the zone with pro-government narratives using generative AI tools. We see deep fakes, we see synthetic news anchors, AI generated commentary. For listeners, you might be thinking, is this more than the usual kind of propaganda? Or is something fundamentally different happening? So, Prateek, is generative AI used by states and aligned actors to shape narratives or control information in a way truly unprecedented?
That's a great question, I think. And before I get into maybe the specific part about generative AI, I want to maybe quickly just try to situate it into the broader, information ecosystem and how I try to think about it and what helps me, right? And again, it's not, uh, it's a very simplistic representation of the space, but it just sort of helps me look at the different actors who are involved, what their various incentives are, right? So just imagine an inverted triangle, right? And you have on the top left you have your states, right, which could essentially include uh, your government of the day, whether it's at the local level, whether it's at the national level, right? And if you're talking about more global governance conversations, then it could also include multilateral institutions. It could include political parties and actors as well, right? And then on the right of that inverted triangle, on the right side, you have the information infrastructure, right? What we think of as social media platforms for sure, messaging applications, of course, everyone who's responsible for the physical infrastructure of the internet. uh, your generative AI chatbots, I think, are now entering this space certainly over the last couple of years. And I think where I deviate from other models of this is that I also put in the news media in this in this bucket, because there is a information production component happening there, right? And then you have societies, of course, which is us, people like us, trying to make sense of a lot of these things. You have various experts who are also within this larger ecosystem and trying, and also downstream from the incentives of other actors as well, right? So we have to take that into account. You have civil society organizations, you have content creators and things like that, right? The only thing I'll point out is that these buckets they're not neat, right? You could very easily make the case for some actors to be across, right? So political parties can in some senses be an extension of the state, and certain times they're mobilizing society, so you might think of them as society as well. Content creators is an interesting one, because the way consumption patterns are shifting, and certainly over the last few years, and we've seen survey after survey say that people aren't necessarily consuming their information from news outlets, but from individuals. Maybe there's a case for this to be, for them to be thought of as in the infrastructure bucket as well, right? But then you follow their, I think all of this then leads to incentives as well, right? And so you look at states, and that's where we sort of started the conversation. States generally come at this from, and this is from the experience that I've been working in, and things like that, right? So you come in from the very often from the incentive of wanting to control and shape narratives, right? Which can be through direct messaging, or it can be through just getting control over institutions or weakening them over a period of time, right? And what we've also seen in a lot of these contexts is that uh, there's often political dividends and limited costs being imposed on them when they go out and act in this way, right? And then if you look at you look at information in the information infrastructure component, there are various incentives there, right? In terms of if you look at each actor, each the media organization have their own set of challenges that they're dealing with right now in terms of business models changing and things like that, right? And then the companies have the more traditional incentives of trying to maximize, quote unquote, maximize shareholder value, and monetize as much as possible, which then leads to design choices that we've seen, and you're sort of seeing that carry on with your chatbots and generative AI as well. I guess with the added question mark, and we'll probably talk about this later, is of there's this component of dominance in terms of the epistemology, right? In and how the chatbot interface, where you're not consuming information from multiple sources as you would maybe with search or social media, you're getting it from one place, and how that, what role is that going to play, right? And then finally you have societies again, and this will vary from different parts of the world. So you'll have, you generally have, or you could have cases where there's low information and digital literacy. And certainly I think in the case of generative AI, we're seeing that people are struggling to really make sense of what may be a synthetically generated image or a video. And we've seen the evolution over the last couple of years, right? Where you could first you could with a reasonable degree of confidence at least be suspicious of something that was probably generative AI, but I think that's gotten harder and harder to do. For me personally, it was, I think, that example where you had the kangaroo holding a boarding pass, unable to board a plane. I think that was a video which I discovered in a context where people were debating it, so I thought of it as as generative, as something that was synthetic. But I think if I chanced upon it, or someone, family member shared it with me, I probably may not have realized that it was synthetic, right? And you're seeing this across, and so there are questions of how, how we respond to that, right? So now you have this, so now we come back, I guess, to the original question of how states are using it and are states using it, right? And I think, given, if you follow the logic that, in this information ecosystem, states are generally, very often, trying to shape narratives, control narratives, uh, you will see, it's quite logical that they will use it, right? Now, in terms of how they're using it, I think there have been some interesting examples. I think the Indian elections were quite an interesting use case, the general elections from 2024, where a lot of the concern, I think, leading up to the elections, was about something, equivalent of political deep fakes for disinformation, and that, and and some of that happened, sure. But I think the most significant use case that we saw was in terms of workflow optimization, right? Where uh, in that case, you had people, using it to generate calls to prospective voters in the voices of political parties. Now, I've not seen so much of that follow on, in terms of, at least not a lot of reporting on it in subsequent state level elections. But that was one, in terms of just workflow optimization. I think the other aspect that you have to look at also, especially in a place like in India, where you have various political parties who operate their quote unquote IT cells, right? And how it could be used to simplify those workflows, right? In terms of making it easier to churn out messages, right? Or to quickly generate images and memes, which are a significant component of narrative propagation here, right? Where very often you have memes and images and short videos with dehumanizing context and things like that, or which tend to use humor in bigoted ways and things like that. So how has it how have generative AI tools got into these workflows, right? And again, I think we're seeing more and more of this. I think the actors are so scattered at this stage. It's not consistent per se, but we're seeing more uh, evidence that this will, it'll get deployed that way, right? In terms of just making it easier to produce information at scale. And I think there are some studies who've have looked at this in a more information operation kind of setting, right? Where it's been looked at in terms of just being able to generate a lot more, a higher volume of messages, and across a larger, a significantly higher breadth of topics, uh,
Right.
right?
So we see that what you say, that despite the constraints and the enablers and the incentives being many, but despite that, we also see that it's becoming more efficient, given that what you said about workflow, it is an efficiency tool, generative AI. That was the most idea. And when we see this, therefore, I've always been grappling with this question that in terms of qualitatively, we have seen propaganda evolve over the years. But qualitatively, does it actually give some, because given that it creates this hyper real, what you mentioned about the kangaroo example, it is so absurd. And yet, if you had just come upon it and you would have said that, okay, it looks very real, right?
Yeah.
Given the hyper realism and the capacity of the state to control the legal frameworks on its use, despite the diverse actors, is there something that you see which is qualitatively uh, very different from the kind of disinformation and propaganda that we saw in the past few years with social media?
Yeah, I think we're probably still in early stages of that, right? In the sense that there is. as of now, there is a part dependence in the sense that you're using it in the same ways. So and for example, in India, you've had cases where political parties, like I said, have used uh, uh, have generate during the elections, have during various, even the general election and the state election, right, have used various forms of animation, right,
Mm.
to dehumanize Muslims in the country. In one election, it was an animated video, right. More recently, it was a synthetically generated video, right. So in terms of the ways in which some of these being used, there is a continuation there, in terms of that form of use, right. But like I said, I think we're at early stages of this.
Right.
It's going to be, we will probably see different use cases as we go on. I guess the other question there is, it's still not clear, uh, it helping generate more, maybe more numbers and more things like that, right. But it's not clear if there is a difference in the persuasive element of these messages, right. And I
Mm.
think that's something to consider, and probably something that we don't know enough of, right. I think there have been some early studies in this which said it's more or less similar to human generated messages at scale, but I think we still have to understand this aspect as well, that is it more persuasive, or is it, or very often do people know that, look, this is synthetic, and and it's funny, so they'll share it, or that you're, for example, you're making fun of a political leader, and it's synthetic, right, but you're just sharing it because you're part of the you're part of the group that doesn't like that person, and you're sharing it, or you're making fun of them, right. So
Mm.
I think we still have to see in terms of whether it creates a significant difference in it actually in its persuasiveness of the messages, but certainly in terms of scale, it's it you know it's been, I think we'll see a more significant impact in the coming years. But I want to tie that back, because even though the persuasive question is sort of unanswered, there is still a risk even with the scale aspect of it, right? Because you do have these models that are going out and training themselves all over the internet, and you don't know, and we don't often know how, what they're consuming, how they're training it, right? So it's also unclear if this
Right.
you know this if this mass propaganda that's generated at scale, which may not be viewed by humans to a large extent, and you're probably not getting a lot of engagement on those particular operations or those websites, or or whatever it is. But if they're finding themselves back into the information pipeline through training the models, and then people are
Mm.
consuming that, uh, that's also a risk and something to watch out for, right? Because I think this is still anecdotal at this point, but more and more people are starting to go to an LLM as their first point of a lookup, right?
Right.
And so if that information is downstream from some of these operations, or from some of these things, then it's again unclear on what role that'll play, and how that'll shape up more broadly, right? Maybe in that context, its persuasiveness is increased already, right? So I think there are those complicating factors to keep in mind
I
as we're
like
thinking through some of this stuff.
Right, Pratik, because I actually find this that while we so focus on scale, but as you rightly said, the scale itself, behind the scale is also shifting the Overton window, and what is our threshold of tolerance for what is acceptable and unacceptable. Like you said, it started from a cartoon, then it goes to synthetic images, then it goes to actual videos, the kind of and I really and I totally agree with the point you're making on this reinforcement learning. Maybe they reinforce the biases that we are teaching them, and that becomes the new normal and the new knowledge, the font of knowledge, the new way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit and look at the regional dynamics. For instance, we see India, there is a lot of debate about labeling AI generated content and distinguishing high risk from low risk AI use cases. In EU, for example, they have graded the risks of AI content. In Brazil, the Data Protection Authority is going after Meta when it comes to the use of training data. what we find that in different parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, we find that regulatory capacities and political incentives can look very different from what they look in Western Europe. So, for those listening from different regions, you might be asking, is what's happening in my country unique or part of a broader pattern? And this brings me to Pratik again. Does AI driven propaganda look and operate differently in the countries that you have studied, whether it is in the global south countries like in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, or in European countries? And do you see that these approaches are starting to travel and gain ground across regions? Because we're looking a bit more about autocratic diffusion.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's a good question. Now, there are a lot of countries that I haven't studied as closely as I would look at, look at India, because that's been primarily a lot of the focus of a lot of my focus on this subject, right? But I think we should expect that there will be similarity, right? And again, if you go back to that logic of uh, especially in environments where state enforcement capacity is not very strong. You don't have very strong institutions to help you respond to some of these things. The grievance redressal mechanisms that states have are not necessarily very robust, right? So, and this speaks to a lot of countries, right? And then you add on that aspect of the fact that, look, for political actors, their incentive is to, as much as possible, shape the information environment and try and control it, right? So I think as we see more of this being deployed across multiple countries, I think we should expect to see that continuation. That continuation. I think, again, the other aspect of this, just to look at, is we tend to focus a lot on the political information and political disinformation aspect of it. But I think in a lot of these places where we're likely to see the greater risk and the greater harms are from use cases where they're being used to scam people,
Mm.
right? And use cases where they're being used for to generate synthetic non-consensual intimate imageries, very often targeting women, right? And I think those that's an important thing for many countries to consider, right? And in terms of how they're going to respond to those problems. And again, it's important to highlight, even in that context, what matters is the base level of institutions and how they function. It's not probably too hard to write up a law that says, hey, using it in this context is illegal or banned, right? But then the question is, do you actually have the ability to detect and enforce it? And when someone is a victim of that, what redressal mechanisms do they have, right? So I think this is a very important question, is for a lot of countries to consider, especially where there is the low digital literacy aspect of it, right? And very prevalent in India right now, where you're seeing this deployed in scams of various sorts. uh, and again, it's not infrequent to have cases where women are targeted, right, with this. And again, and only a fraction of them probably make the news, right? Most of these go unreported, right? And very often, unless there's media attention, things don't move, right? So there is that element of what's happening with generative AI, I think, for us uh, to consider, especially across the global majority, right? I think we'll see a lot of this. The political disinformation aspect of it, yes, will continue. I think there's a lot of continuity there from the social media conversation and the social media regulation conversation. So I think we'll continue uh, having that conversation. But I think for global majority folks, we should also be looking out for these kind of use cases
Right. I
or
find this
risks.
extremely important that you have really highlighted, because this is what we see. Like in social media, we were looking at polarization impact, also alienation impact, even the chilling effect. And you rightly point out how generative AI has made these threats even more acute, especially for women We have been hearing cases of their body being morphed, and this is leading many of them not to post their photos and images online. Forget about even speaking. Lot all the whole the promise and potential of the digital space as a site of expression, as a site of creativity. Do you think that is being reversed? Because I think maybe if we do not bring in the regulatory guardrails right from the get-go, and this brings us to the accountability or the lack of it. Like I've been reading about civil society groups in India, in Indonesia, in Brazil, and elsewhere, many warning of very weak AI regulation combined with very strong industrial lobbying. And at the same time, many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, they face structural power imbalances when it comes to trying to shape global norms of AI,
Yeah.
which actually has at the micro level, at the micro level, it has impact at individual level of freedom of expression. Again, to our civil society audiences, if you are listening, you might feel that it's a sense that rules are being written elsewhere and often not in your favor. So, Pratik, here I want to come back to the global accountability because you brought in a very you you broadened this our focus more from propaganda and political content, but to everyday harms, everyday online harms that people face, where accountability becomes so important, and yet certain countries seem to dictate what global framework should be look like. So here, how do you think can countries from as you describe global majority, speak up, especially the multi-stakeholder, when their governments may not be speaking with the same voice, where the deck is already stacked against civil society and independent media. How can we have a more representative and inclusive? What mechanisms can be brought in for there to be a more even-handed representation and voice of people from these countries, especially India, since you're so
Yeah.
familiar with India.
No, this is a great question, and one of the things uh, that occupies a lot of my thinking, especially in my current role at Tech Global Institute as well, right? But one added bit of context that I'll add, especially for civil societies in civil society organizations in many countries, right, is that uh, you're also looking at you're looking at the fact that many of the technology platforms are not accountable, right? We're not able to hold them accountable in many ways. You also have governments that you may not necessarily trust with with regulation because they are driven from an impulse of control rather than actually
Mhm.
the harm or the risk mitigation aspect, right? And that, right? So you're in this very weird bind, right, where it's a question of maybe very often whom you trust less, right, and then trying to find your way out of that. And I think as you said, I think the other challenge is that a lot of these conversations are happening at various global forum where we've again historically seen that it is hard for civil society voices from large parts of the world to actually find their way into these conversations, right? Now, yes, a lot of these processes are enable some form of multi-stakeholder participation, but really not nearly enough, right? Where there is, if you're really tracking them closely, there is ability to try and participate in some of the consultations that are going on at any given point in time. But I think we also have to recognize that a lot of organizations who are working within their countries uh, are low on resources, low on capacity, and are probably taken most of their time is taken up just dealing with their day-to-day issues and those survival things, right? You don't necessarily have the bandwidth to look at some of these global issues. But I think that's where the importance of finding a way to either make coalitions, be a part of coalitions comes in, right? So even if you're not able to, as a single civil society organization, you're not able to do it. Uh, Through coalitions, you're able to build a more collective collective voice and collective representation very often may be a collective view or a position on some of these issues, right? Again, this is much easier said than done, right? This is much easier said than done, but I think this is a part of the challenge many of us face because, like I said, right, it's this unhappy situation where you don't necessarily trust the countries and you don't have enough local regulation to hold them accountable, and you don't necessarily ensure you don't have a lot of faith that if domestic regulation will address or will come from the right incentive and will meaningfully address the problem, right? So then it's a question of uh, how often can you find what global forum can you look at. I think there's probably one interesting one that's coming up since we're talking about it in terms of finding a way to for civil society organizations around the world to make it at least to articulate a position on what we want from global governance conversations on artificial intelligence, right? So uh, again, you have these AI summits that have been going on in various countries, right? And I think the next one is happening
Indeed.
in India. Now, I know there's a lot of political context to each of these summits, and we probably won't be able to unpack all of that. But I think just as a place to, uh, as a place where there will be a lot of attention to the conversation and an opportunity to highlight or articulate what we would want as global major as organizations from the global majority. I think it serves a that summit will serve a uh, useful point in that conversation. Of course, the work has to continue, through to beyond that, and I guess future iterations of it, as well as whatever's happening at various UN processes, right? This so parts of this will come up in some of the cybercrime convention conversation. Some of it will happen in the science panels and things like that, right? So those will continue, but we also have to then look at places or events that are likely to occupy a lot of mind share, right? And then try and push for our voices and our positions to be articulated over there. So
Right.
there's not a full answer to your question about accountability, but I think we have to recognize that we are operating in an imperfect space. So then through advocacy, what can you really how can you make use of the avenues that we have available to us to position ourselves?
Exactly, Pratik, because I guess we have been thinking that now they have across the world we see a lot of gains that on regulating platforms have been reversed. A lot of regulations are getting watered down, and uh, for example, in we are also finding there is less of convergences between previously progressive minded countries when it came to regulating technology and big tech companies. So in this kind of a situation of flux, where, as you rightly pointed out, finding out mechanisms and avenues to at least uh, amplify collective voices and concerns becomes more urgent is in this crunch time. So, and this brings me to the last question, which I think is more about thinking forward because you're marshaling the forces, gathering resources, trying to do collective advocacy, as well as trying to gain space, as you said, mind space of the people to whom you are reaching out to, build that awareness. Probably that is the collective strength. So, if we try to think in more forward terms about how can these efforts be impactful and what can meaningful accountability look like? For example, for listeners especially, you may also write to think that what should we actually be asking from governments, from platforms, and from international bodies? And here, how do we hold tech companies in concrete ways as well as governments to account in this kind of an environment that we are currently?
Yeah, no, that's a great and very difficult question, especially in the reality of the current geopolitics and the fact that like you said, many especially the American companies, have recalibrated their approach because of domestic political development, right? But I think, while pushing forward, I'll maybe come to accountability mechanism in a second. But I think the first thing, and I think most people who like to do research will first say that, look, we have to understand a lot of this better, right? And I say that because I don't think, again, this is not a space that we've fully understood the impacts. And while we may not fully, I don't think we'll get to a point where we fully understand it, but I don't think we've grappled enough with the changes that we'll see in the information ecosystem, with how business models are changing, how consumption patterns are changing, right? What does it mean for the actual economic logic of the internet, when most websites are not getting referral traffic back from search engines, and and people are going to chatbots, uh, right? Where, so one is there's that economic aspect of it. There's a societal aspect of it, because people are also having, we're seeing these cases of, we're seeing these very unfortunate cases where minors are having conversations of, uh, with some of these generative AI chatbots, and in some cases also leading to self harm, right? And I think it's also important to then try and understand why that's happening. What avenues are missing, that people are going and seeking these sort of responses or interventions from a chatbot, right? Why that happens? So there are a lot of societal aspects to unpack on the one hand, right? There is, on the accountability uh, front, I think there is something to be said for, I think there is, even in Europe, there is this uh, uh, tendency to focus on processes, and look at what the companies are doing, and I think that's an important interim step while we're figuring some of the larger societal implications out. Now, I don't really have a good list of what exactly these should be, but I think, coming together and figuring out what those processes are, which in many ways, if you think about it, right, it's actually going back to very simple uh, good corporate governance standards kind of conversation, right? It's actually just going back to that. With it should be simple enough for a company, that they shouldn't have to, uh, if they're not sure that a product works in a certain, in a certain use case, well, they shouldn't be encouraging that use case, right? That's very simple, good corporate governance per se. But we've not seen that, right? Because accountability mechanisms across the board have not been able to keep up with this, and for various reasons. One is they're global companies. How do you do it at a local level? So, that there are challenges there, but a lot of this then just comes back to, look, what are you making the companies do in terms of their internal processes, safeguards, etc., and then how can you ensure they stick to them? Because that's precisely the challenge we're in right now, right? Where, like you said, even the progress that had been made over the last couple of years is being reversed because of uh, geopolitical changes, right? So then do we consider going back to having some of these governed domestically, right? Which again brings back my earlier trade-off of how will that happen? Will that happen with the with the right incentives, and will lead to the right outcome, right? So I think you'll still have a bit of that challenge there. But I think, as a starting point, I would say that one is the understanding aspect of it, which we really need to build upon. And I think that's an intervention, because today you don't have the capacity to do a lot of this research, right? So then what can we do to actually build up that capacity to have this understanding, to improve our understanding of some of this? I think to a large extent we missed that bus uh, with social media, right? In the sense of not investing in research early enough. A lot of it came,
Later.
much
Post-COVID.
later, right? Much later, where we already sort of saw the many of the risks and the issues manifesting, and then you were always playing catch up. Again, given how fast AI is moving, you could probably argue that we're already at that point, but but maybe we're not, right? And maybe if we focus enough on trying to understand some of these aspects, we can figure out where to intervene, right? And I think
Right.
because that's the important aspect of it, because a lot of this comes back to the fact that one, on the corporate accountability side, you need essentially strong corporate governance principles and to be able to enforce them. And on the societal side, you need strong social institutions to be able to respond when you have these unintended consequences playing out, right? And those are your two fundamentals, but those are also hard to do. And I think that's the challenge that we're at, right? It's easy to relatively easy to pass a law and say, hey, we've said this, we've said XYZ needs to happen, but it doesn't always play out that way, right? You need to build up the regulatory infrastructure to actually enforce it, and two, you need to build up the social institutions to then be able to for society to respond, because you're never going to be able to control how people use these things, right? And I think
Right.
that's something that we have to acknowledge, that for all the planning that we might do in terms of processes and regulation and things like that, people are going to use these tools in ways that we've not imagined, which will lead to situations that we can't foresee, risks that we can't foresee. But then it all goes back to, if you have strong enough social institutions and things to help you respond, it will help mitigate a lot of that, even if not solve everything.
Right. So I actually like that you're giving this holistic perspective, because often it becomes about, as you rightly said, about just processes and bad solutions rather than the ecosystem in which technology operates and to what extent it can change a society. I hope this the accountability models that comes through collective action and capacity building reflects the priorities and realities of both the Western and non-Western worlds, rather than one solution being exported from one region to the
Yeah.
other. So, Pratik, thank you so much for walking us through these complex and crucial issues and giving us. I always enjoy, as I've always told you, your articles because they are so layered, so textured, and they give us a 360-degree perspective, which I think is very important for us to understand technology in its different facets and its impacts. To our listeners, if this conversation sparked thoughts or questions, we'd love to hear from you. How is generative AI shaping civic space where you live? In our next episode, we will be exploring how law, technology, and power interact in different parts of the world and what that means for defending democratic space online. This was a wonderful episode with Pratik. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you for enriching us with
And thank
your.
you so much for having me.
My pleasure. And thank you, viewers, for joining in. We look forward to hearing from you in our GIGA social media platforms. Until then, I'm Sangeeta Mahapatra for the GIGA. Thank you for listening.